Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. There's plenty of resources out there for anti-Zionist folks to figure out how to have difficult conversations with the Zionists in their lives. You might find, say, a guide for talking to relatives during the high holidays, or maybe there's a headline like, what to do with your liberal Zionist friends. Basically, there's a plethora of curricula that help people navigate the ways in which Zionism has torn apart or destroyed relationships. Much less commonly explored, though, are the ways in which anti-Zionist activism opened new dynamics in relationships. It's actually something quite generative. So our guests today are two friends of mine who explore the ways in which anti-Zionism and Palestine solidarity work have created new, profound aspects in their families and in their friendships. Roy Danovitch is the associate head of an independent school in the Bay Area, and Dani Friedrich is a professor of curriculum and teaching at Teachers College, Columbia University. And not so coincidentally, Roy and Dani have both worked, both of them publicly and behind the scenes, to challenge their educational institutions. And so we'll hear from Roy first and then Dani, and let's listen in to this Educator Friends episode.
So I think we should start by just being a little transparent here and saying, this is an episode about educator friends. So we should be transparent that we have a relationship outside of the podcast. We can get into that throughout the conversation, but we became friends in grad school. Your partner and I shared the same advisor, and we kind of got to know each other through conferences and things. And before we get into the relationship aspect of what it means to be an anti-Zionist, I'd be interested to hear your journey. Maybe we could start with how you learned Zionism growing up as an Israeli American.
Sure. I think I never learned it. And being born in Israel, it was just simply a function of the scenery. And Israel and Zionism to me, Zionism wasn't something I came across outside of books on the topic in my grandparents' library. That came a little bit later, but my early experiences growing up in the south of Israel, until I was about 3 years old when we moved to the States, was almost kind of like a halcyon period, which I associated with my grandparents, with the beach, with the beautiful weather, with speaking Hebrew, with having an Israeli mother and a father who was religious early in his life and maybe even a little bit Zionist, but had become a little bit more secular, a little bit more critical. Really, as a concept, I wasn't aware of Zionism. My identity was just as an Israeli kid. And then, of course, as I grew older, certain things begun to stick out a little bit. Around my grandparents' house in Bat Yam in Israel, there were all these streets named after, British politicians like Jabotinsky and Balfour. And so that struck me as a little bit strange, but I didn't know why. And as I mentioned, seeing books on the topic helped me kind of understand that this was a serious topic, a topic of great importance. And because my mom is Israeli, my dad's British, I understood that Israel was somehow connecting these two different threads of my family for two completely different reasons. One had come to Israel after the Holocaust, as a form of aliyah from England after the war. And my mom's side of the family had fled Stalin from Russia in order to fulfill the socialist vision of the country, kind of a working class vision of the country. So how those two threads kind of operated, I wasn't aware of it, but it certainly formed part of my early experiences thinking about those topics.
And did this persist when you kind of entered formalized education? Like, did Zionism just build and build and build? Were you always maybe not even learning, but just it was your entire world?
Even the temple I went to when we moved to Los Angeles, the Zionism that I was taught in that context was Zionism light compared to what I later saw in other institutions. It was simply presenting the miracle of the story of Israel, and Palestine was an absence. It didn't come up as a more serious topic until it was represented as the conflict or terrorism or some challenge to the whole idea of Israeli self-determination. But it wasn't in my consciousness at all as a frame of reference. And Zionism to me was just simply this idea that, Jews around the world had this homeland and anybody could return, and through birthright, they could claim their heritage, they could claim the country for their own, or the country represented all Jews. That was just a non-problematic part of my kind of intellectual world until I was in high school a little bit later. But I was always aware, in elementary school and middle school, that whenever my family would get together, there would be really intense disputes about the Six-Day War, about the West Bank, about the occupation. And it was such an intimidating topic to me. And it was just filled with these intense passions that I felt I didn't even have the language to engage because it just felt so, challenging. And I felt like I had to know so much to understand it. So I just sort of accepted the version of Judaism and Zionism, which was shared to me. And I didn't critique it because it didn't get in my way. And we weren't a family that was sort of aggressively or avowedly pro-Israel in that kind of sense. We were connected to the country because, I was born there. My mom was Israeli. But it was only until a little bit later that I sort of begun to understand the kind of larger historical context behind my parents' own connection to Israel, and their specific breaking points which were a little bit different.
So it sounds like there are these family conversations that you didn't feel necessarily qualified to engage in yet, but maybe, are we 48 Jews? Are we 67 Jews? That kind of back and forth. And
that's right.
Yeah.
And I think, I was really lucky to go to a very progressive middle school and high school. And I remember reading Howard Zinn in Carol Winter's class, my middle school history teacher, People's History of the United States, and reading about the, massacre of indigenous Native Americans, and then later having an ethics teacher who taught us Chomsky and Edward Said. And that was the first time that I really came across a significant and persuasive critique of everything that I had accepted, and from a Jewish perspective, and sort of using almost a Jewish secular social justice lens. And I think that experience was really, really significant because while it didn't completely and totally transform me, that came a little bit later. It provided me with a language to begin really challenging the understanding of history and the kind of unblemished stature of Israel and the kind of Jewish imagination, as on a noble crusade on behalf of Jews to protect them from having another Holocaust, to be this little tiny country surrounded by enemies that was able to build up business, economy, culture, music, art, who claimed Einstein and Marx as part of the intellectual tradition. Now I came across both anti-Zionist and non-Zionist Jewish thinkers that really opened up a whole other avenue for me to engage with the topic.
So if Said and Chomsky and Zinn are planting the seeds of anti-Zionism, but you said this isn't a singular moment, this is the beginning. Where did the rupture really blossom?
Right. So, later in high school, I think this was high school, like maybe freshman year of college, actually maybe senior year of high school, I went to Chetz V'Keshet. It was sort of an Israeli army camp where, American Jews and Israelis in America come to Israel and essentially learn about the country by getting to learn from soldiers who teach you how to use a compass, who help you kind of navigate, all kinds of hostile spaces, and who build in you that kind of Boy Scout camaraderie. But even then, I was aware, even in some of the teachings at Chetz V'Keshet, this camp, that there was a lot of indoctrination happening. And they were presenting the Palestinians as a nuisance, and they were representing Israel's battle as a fight against terrorism from people who wanted to destroy it and remove it from existence. So I was aware of the indoctrination taking place there, and I think a little bit later in my 20s, when I started working in a coeducational modern Orthodox high school, I actually took a trip with the school to Israel, and one of the first places that we went was the West Bank, were the occupied territories. I think this school was, even though it sort of supported democratic dialogue and the rest, when it came to the Israel trip, it had a very specific ideological approach, which was sending kids to seminaries in the West Bank and teaching them that this was part of the greater Israel story. And for me, I began to see and recognize the very specific architecture of the occupation in ways that Chomsky and Said and many others had kind of dimly laid out. And it was seeing that, and also seeing the way in which Jewish terrorists were being valorized. Baruch Goldstein, who murdered, countless worshipers, I think it was in the late 80s or early 90s, there was a kind of a museum in one of the settlements, I can't remember which one, where he was represented as a great hero. And moving around the West Bank, seeing the checkpoints, seeing the ways the legal system and the sewage system and the transportation system privileged Jewish supremacy. And there were Jewish-only roads, and then there were these other kind of points where the Palestinians were sort of reduced to these kind of like fragmented cantons. I left that trip, I was never the same. In fact, I actually went to visit my sister who was studying medicine at Sackler University in Tel Aviv, who's just like me, who's kind of liberal, progressive, and she just noticed something in me that was just not the same. And it felt as if that reality was totally hid from me. This reality that I mentioned that was an absence growing up, that was only 20 miles away, both 20 miles south of where I was born in Gaza and 30 miles to the east in Jerusalem and the territories. I had no idea. Didn't show up in any of my history textbooks, was only represented as a nuisance, wasn't ever expressed as something that the Jews were doing.
It also sounds like there's kind of this broad conceptual way in which you're almost reading to prepare for those conversations in your past with your family, right? Like as if you want to be informed and have, because of course this present absence of Palestinian voices was so often delegitimated. When speaking in Zionist circles, there needs to be
That's right.
this breaking the silence and these critical Israeli voices to say, no, look, it's us who are saying that Israel's not great.
And it was really hard because, like all my grandparents on my mom's side, so my dad's side, they were all killed in the camps. They're all exterminated in the camps. My sister's brother was killed in the Yom Kippur War, was paralyzed when Syria invaded Israel during Yom Kippur. And I knew that there was a lot of intellectual heft behind, and a lot of emotional and sentimental heft behind the image of Israel towards that generation of Jews who either fled the Holocaust, escaped the Holocaust, and thought of Israel as their only homeland. And I had to really accept and appreciate that because that was part of my story. And so even in my conversations today with people who were directly and personally touched by that experience, the kind of discourse is a little bit different because it was such a traumatic experience that I think it negated some of the space for conversations about Israel as a state. That's not true with everybody who either experienced the Holocaust or is directly kind of connected to it in some other way. But it made it really, really difficult for me, and I kind of understood and appreciated that. And I also sought to represent what I thought was acceptable and egalitarian features of Israeli society and separate it from the state. So I remember when BDS became a movement, and initially I had a lot of trouble with it because Israel was represented as an apartheid state when I felt apartheid was just simply located in the West Bank and the territories, and that actually Israeli society was heterogeneous. You had, Arab doctors, you had Palestinian workers, you had a kind of fairly mixed society with, of course, some discrimination, but it wasn't an apartheid state. I tried to represent the perspective that actually, no, we shouldn't be boycotting, academics and scholars in Israel who are doing important work. Let's distinguish them from the state. So when we say we're anti-Israel or we're critical of Israel, we're critical of very specific policies. And so I was trying to kind of occupy a position on the left where I could thread that needle. And it became a harder argument to support as Israeli society became, more and more religious, less and less tolerant of critique, and where the peace camp in Israel just essentially eroded as the religious right took over. So, that was a really big shift for me in terms of how I represented and talked about Israel.
I want to step back for a second here because I'm wondering, you're talking about trying to occupy this unique position on the left, and part of what we're going to discuss today is the role you have within educational institutions. And we kind of glossed over, you were working at a modern Orthodox school, saw the occupation firsthand. What do you do with that, with a school that took you there on a trip to begin with? How did you negotiate that within your professional position?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cognitive dissonance proved too difficult for me to manage. It wasn't the reason why I left the school, because I had been at the school for about 9 or 10 years. And I have to say, they kind of accepted me. I remember playing an interview I did of Chomsky, because I've interviewed him a few times at Shalhevet, and really appreciating the fact that in this school with a Zionist identity, they were actually willing to kind of permit and support and embrace what I was engaging in. And I think I got away with a lot of it because I could always return it back to the fact that, look, I'm Israeli, my name is Roy, I'm Roy. So maybe if I didn't have that capital, I would be in a different situation. But it became too difficult to manage. I think I'm really good at occupying unique spaces in different religious or secular settings. So I felt like my responsibility in that context at a modern Orthodox school with a Zionist identity was to represent the left more powerfully and to provide a critique that was engaging and thoughtful, but important and rooted in the Jewish tradition and the humanistic tradition more broadly. I felt that was my job there, and the way I could actually find fulfillment is not kind of giving up, is also connecting with a lot of the students I'm still really close with, who themselves felt alienated by what they felt was a one-size-fits-all Jewish identity. And so connecting with those kids and giving them, helping them create community, I felt was really, really important. But it became too difficult to square the circle working in that school, and given how my politics were evolving, that the time was right for me to leave.
You have started to tease out a little bit about the tension present in family conversations, and I think that I'll probably repeat it on the intro, and I'll probably repeat it with our other guests for today. But I think that there's this real, in our own conversations, and I've started to notice there's this real interesting flip side of the coin that so much of the educational material I've seen in the last 15 months is how to have difficult conversations with your family, how to navigate, the high holidays with your Zionist friends and family. And you're hinting at that, but I'd like to hear the opposite. How has anti-Zionism challenged family? Sure, but how has it opened up new dynamics in your relationship?
It's great because one of those things where once you kind of see each other and you know that there's someone else who shares your perspectives and value systems, you're like, oh, you exist? Like, oh my gosh, it's kind of like you're talking in like hushed tones. You're like that's insane. Really, you went through that too? So I think maybe there's a little bit more visibility for people who have grown up in this environment and are kind of extricating themselves out of it. But for me, like, it's opened up relationships with students first and foremost, because the great thing about students is in high school, they're always asking tough questions. And I always identified with kids who were a little bit provocative and rebellious anyway. And those connections to me are critical. So the students who I know who are still active in the anti-Zionist movement, and come from a deeply ethical lens, my connection with them and relationship with them over the years has been incredibly helpful, both for me and for them, because they're dealing with difficult parents, difficult conversations. They're worried about their job. They're thinking about what happens if I speak up a little bit too loudly. There are incredible family members I know who feel like they've been outcast within the family because they're doing activist work in the West Bank, working with Palestinian farmers and agricultural workers, being in conversation with them and knowing how they feel in Israel and their level of fear has been really helpful for me, I think helpful for them. As you mentioned, my partner Erica, who is from Venezuela originally and moved to Kuwait when she was 14 or 15, has been decisive in many ways, not only because her family in Venezuela, many of them are leftists who take a very critical approach to both kind of capitalism and imperialism. They think outside of the Western lens. And so being in conversation with her just shared a kind of a non-Western default position perspective that allowed me to go even further in my thinking, and who made me more critical. So I always give Erica so much credit for making me critical and providing a context that has been kind of missing in my life in many ways. That has been essential. And then, I have a lot of friends, Iranian Jews growing up, who are really active in different movements around Palestinian solidarity. Has brought me like so much closer to these friends. I think it's allowed me to be a better parent. We grew up in Oakland. It's a very progressive town, and that's really, really important to Eric and I. And about a month after October 7th, I took my daughter, who was 4 years old, to a ceasefire protest. And so it's opened a relationship with my daughter, who's not going to grow up with the same baked assumptions as I will, and will have a different understanding of Israel. That if you stand on the side of justice, here are different ways you can engage in the topic. So I think it's actually changed the way I parent too. And in terms of my relationships with family members who are still supportive of Israeli policy or kind of on the fence or a little, I just view it as an opportunity to teach and to be taught. And I have to take a pedagogical stance in these conversations. And I have to think about the different angles to help them move and overcome their epistemic barriers. But then I can only do that by kind of recognizing where they're coming from. I don't have to agree with their perspective, but if I'm not listening to them, then there's going to be no overcoming the thaw. And with family, you're with each other forever. So it's in your interest to sort of try to create space for dialogue, but then realizing the point at which the valorization of dialogue in the Jewish tradition is part of the problem. Everything is, we love complexity, we engage with debate and discussion, but when it comes to state policy, we don't do that. The one space where it's this important, we don't do it, but we do it in any other context. When we're talking about how rabbis debate and discuss, when we're talking about, so that stuff is really important. And I should go back to just really, really quickly. I think I didn't mention it at the outset, but a lot of the texts that were really important to me, beyond Chomsky and of course Edward Said, were books about the Jewish tradition before the foundation of the state, where the diversity of the Jewish tradition across socialism and communism and even different strands of Zionism, which right now is just a statist policy, helped me sort of appreciate the way in which Israel as a state flattened the diversity of this tradition. And that if we could just remove the state from the way in which we identify reflexively with Judaism, we would uncover like a diasporic tradition that was brilliant and abundant and ethical and justice-oriented, that is just below the surface, but has been completely repressed by the state.
Yeah, and often goes against any state, right? There's a deep tradition of Jewish anarchism that has
right,
yeah.
Exactly.
I so deeply appreciate that story with your daughter, with the mindset of, because she won't grow up the way you grew up, not giving up on your family or just outright condemning everything they've ever done and said, but to say like, you're really wrestling with them, but this will be a different foundation of our relationship, and one rooted in justice to build a just world.
It's hard, Jordan. It's very difficult because I don't know where I stand with my own connection to Israel and Judaism in general. I thought I could separate the two. I think part of me is more Israeli than Jewish because we're a secular family, and Judaism to me was always an intellectual tradition. We celebrated some of the holidays, but we were never worshiping. And I always understood Israel through the lens of culture and people, and that's what my parents approached it too. But now I feel stuck. In other words, I know where my ethics and politics stand. But when I think about how I'm going to raise my kids, when I think about how I'm going to connect them to the place I was born in, Israel, I'm like, it's just hard. It's hard.
I also know that you lost a position because, even though it's a progressive space, you were deemed kind of too radical. So I wonder how how do you keep pushing? And I don't want to just make this about your own individual story, right? You're bringing up something that's so important about the institution and how to push institutions to reckon with empire and apartheid, and like you said, claiming Jewish values while stealing land is. But how do you approach this in the position of somebody who's no longer able to say, "Oh, I'm in the classroom. I'm going to invite Noam Chomsky. I hope you don't fire me. Go.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of like, it's great. So just going back to like the school I was at before in Oakland, pre-K through 8 school, 90% students of color, like a really culturally responsive school, but with a really white philanthropic base that supported the school to kind of fix broken public schools and not for genuine student-centered reasons. And when the insurrection happened, I took a stance naming white supremacy, and there was a lot of blowback behind that, and I was supported, but it wasn't sustainable. And I experienced a lot of kind of physical and emotional pain, really the burden of sort of kind of taking stances in a way that were at odds with a certain kind of sector of the school that really school leadership comes across and the rest of school might not. I recently got back from New York, where I've over the last like 2 or 3 years, I've like lectured on this topic, both in the philosophy of education program, where my mentor is the director, where every single year I'll do a case study where I'll walk through the previous school or another setting and ask them how they would act when faced with these same kind of situations. Like, what do you do? How do you move as a school leader? And how can you not move? What stances are permissible to take? Which ones aren't, and why? And recently we actually, talked about what leaders do in those contexts. And we do it in the context of things that school leaders are dealing with now, like ICE, repression, DIB, withdrawing funds. But we also talked about Israel-Palestine. And what really came across from the school heads was the way in which they experienced moral injury, which was this framework that I was introducing, which is very familiar to anybody who immediately comes across it, which is basically, when you reason ethically in non-ideal circumstances, you try to like exercise justice in contexts where no just action is possible. And the experience of that causes you pain because you can't live up to your own moral principles. And the way you deal with moral injury, the sense that, you can't do it. These are broken institutions. You can only just kind of navigate it, is through exit. You can leave the school, right? You're done. I'm done with this. You're complicit. I can't be a part of it. I can't square the circle. I'm compromising my moral integrity. You can be loyal. In other words, you can muddle along. You're like, oh, well, I'm paid well, and I got a mortgage, and do I need to kind of like stir it up a little bit, or through voice, which is kind of like a bit of subversion from the inside. It's good trouble, to quote John Lewis. It's kind of trying to look for opportunities to take a stance and to help the school live up to its mission. And many schools, when you actually research them, all are taking these kind of social justice stances, and all are claiming to operate by empowering students as learners and citizens, to tackle injustice, to produce diversity statements. And if that's a statement they're making, it's not a difficult intellectual argument to say that's where this position leads us, to adopt these stances. And so I sought to use my leadership to kind of bridge theory and practice and use the mission and the school's self-proclaimed identity as a way of holding it to honor those values. And that has been really, really helpful. So I think that's what I would say to school leaders is moral injury is a part of it. You have to experience pain. But if you're not doing it, it's just on the teachers, nothing's ever going to move. So you can widen the sphere of action as a school head or a head of a college by making certain kinds of discourse and debate permissible. And some university heads did that really well, and some did it awfully. And if the head's not doing it, then how are teachers, either an independent school who want to teach like provocative books or books that aren't provocative but somehow are provocative now, going to feel supported to do it if the school's not taking a stance and the board's not taking a stance?
I always wonder about the limits of dialogic education, but I always come back to the idea of I think Nazis should be punched, and not engaged, but I also appreciate the people who have deprogrammed Nazis, right?
That's right. I should put a caveat on what I said before is the dialogic approach is not everything is permissible. It's like identifying boundaries of debate and discussion, but also not platforming, perspectives which are, as you mentioned, in line with white supremacy, religious supremacy, because there's symbolic value to platforming perspectives in the name of dialogue, as you mentioned.
I love that idea. And I don't mean this as a dig. This is very genuine. This is almost like when parents are like, I want you to like drink and smoke weed at home because it's safe and I know it's going to happen anyway. It's like, do your Zionism at school because we can engage in that is so true. Because if people feel shut down, I do really see that the idea of like, it's not going to change. It's not going to challenge Zionism. What it's going to do is it's going to push it to more radical other spaces potentially. I really see that argument.
And the kids are okay. Yeah. Like I just recently I saw a group of students who last year would not have kept the same company talking about Israel-Palestine in a really open way and really listening to each other. And I was like talking to a teacher and I was just like, look at that. Like they're okay. Like when the adults kind of get out of the way, like they kind of are curious. And if they kind of respect certain habits of discourse and they listen, space always opens up. That's what's so amazing. You never know when someone's gonna start seeing the world differently.
Dani Friedrich, welcome. So let's just get started by talking a little bit about what Judaism, Israel, and Palestine look like for you growing up. How did you learn about these things? And yeah.
So for that, I need to give a bit of a background of my family history, right? Starting with my grandparents. My grandparents on my mom's side fled Germany right before the war. So they were able to move to Latin America and they moved to Bolivia where there was an emerging Jewish community that was receiving people. And so they moved to Bolivia mostly with most of their possessions and wealth. My grandfather was a doctor and they suffered a lot of trauma in Germany pre-war, but it was sort of a particular kind of trauma. My grandma has a really interesting story that I don't need to go into, but basically she was shipped to Holland and was sort of taken in by a family when she was 6, and then she sailed by herself to Latin America. But so they reformed their family in Bolivia and were pretty successful there, right? And whereas my dad's grandparents, my grandfather survived the camp, but most of his family did not. And my grandmother survived the war hiding from house to house. With much of her immediate family. And they all moved to Bolivia. And both my parents were born in Bolivia. They went to school together from kindergarten to 12 to the only Jewish school in La Paz, which, because the community was not that big, it was Jewish in that it taught Jewish history and a bit of Hebrew, but it also took on non-Jewish kids, and it was sort of a typical middle-class private school. And then my parents moved first, so my mom to Argentina, my dad to Chile, and my mom went to get my dad in Chile, and then they moved to Argentina. And they both consider themselves Jewish, but like many people that I know, both in Argentina, where I was born, and here, is the kind of like family where generation after generation, some of the more religious aspects of Judaism starts to get lost. while retaining some of the cultural aspects of Judaism. And so I, for example, remember growing up in Buenos Aires, going to Shabbat dinners, not all Fridays, but regularly to my dad's parents' house, who moved from Bolivia to Argentina when I was 8. Whereas my mom's parents' house was only a place for gathering for Jewish holidays. I also remember growing up, I went to a school that was interesting because it was a German school in Buenos Aires, a private German school, founded by Jewish people in the 40s who saw themselves as German and wanted a German education, but most other German schools were affiliated with the Nazi Party. So they went a secular German school. And so they funded the school I went to. And the school retained that sort of openness, progressive idea for a private school. By the time I went, it was, I would say, 50-50 Jewish, non-Jewish students. There was no Jewish education in the school. I also went to a Jewish club where there was nothing religious about it, but it was for Jewish people in the outskirts of Buenos Aires to play sports and do like camp and all those things. And as a family, we used to go to synagogue for the high holidays, and that was it. And then I did my bar mitzvah. And so up to that point, I would say I identified clearly as Jewish. I believed sort of the general tenets of the religion. I was familiar with the rites, without ever being even close to religious in terms of traditions, but like going to in the high holidays to synagogue and having sort of a Jewish space in my club, and then the rest of my life was not. And so pre-bar mitzvah, I would say I received sort of the traditional narratives of most people of my age, I think. I was born in 78 to give an idea. So the traditional narrative I mean by that is Israel was founded after the trauma of the Holocaust. It was a return to our land. It was the land that received all Jews, no questions asked. It's a land that always will be there if we're prosecuted anywhere else. It's the land that was ours by birthright. It used to be called Palestine before it was called Israel. So it's a name change, basically.
So you actually knew that growing up? That
it used to be called Palestine.
Yeah.
And then it was called Israel. But there was no talk of the people there. I mean, I never even heard any discussions except for the occasional bombing, suicide bombing, attack, and then the barbarians sort of were on the fringe of the story, right? So there's some barbarians there that want to kill Jews and want that land for themselves. And usually those are people that were supported by the neighboring countries who have always hated Israel and Jews. And that narrative was never questioned. It was the narrative that my parents received in their Jewish school in Bolivia, and they had a much more Jewish existence as white people in Bolivia, in a majority indigenous country. So, yeah. And for me, that was the story up to my bar mitzvah and a bit after.
And was that basically coming from every direction? It's happening in, even though it's secular, this formal schooling experience, it's happening in camps and clubs as you're doing sports, it's happening in family seders and even
in the school, no, there was no education about Israel in my school. There was no talk about that, so at all. Now, it was interesting that we played sports. Our school, I won't say we, but I didn't play sports. But we as a school played sports in the Inter-German School League, right? And at least once a year, there was an incident where one of the kids from the other schools would come to one of our team members and go, effing Jew. even whether they were Jews or not, doesn't matter. But our school was identified within the German schools of the time as the more Jewish-like school. And so that would lead to a fist fight and all that. And we would come out of that feeling very proud of being in that school, right? But there was no formal education about Israel, and there was no narrative about Israel. There was not, but not, I don't think it was censored. It was just not part of the curriculum in Argentina that was not taught. It didn't exist. So when I say it was coming from multiple places, it was coming from my friends that were Jewish. It was coming from my family. It was coming from the club. It was coming from the stories that my parents told us. I don't think there was any other narrative in the media either. One thing that audience might not know is Argentina has a huge Jewish community. Like Buenos Aires is one of the largest in the world. I think the 8th largest Jewish community. At the time I was growing up, it was around 250,000 people. And so Jewish people are very much present in the Buenos Aires, in the city. And so in the media, that was the main narrative. And I don't think I ever thought of questioning it.
So if you grew up not thinking of questioning it, when did you start questioning it?
So I had a very clear break with religion when I was 15. It did not come through Israel, but it led to questioning other things. So it was at a time where I was starting to read more critical stuff about the world in general and being more, I mean, my school was in many ways progressive in that we were talking about poverty and inequality and all those things. And my family was going through a rough patch economically. And finally, Rosh Hashanah came, and I said, okay, let's get ready for a temple, like every other year. And my parents informed me we were not going. And I said, why are we not going? And I said, well, because this year we couldn't pay. And I said, what do you mean? Like, I had no idea. They said, well, yeah, no, for the high holidays, the temples, in order to subsist, they charge. So if you want to sit, you have to pay. And this year we decided not to. And I was I had no idea that not only did you pay, but there were tiers, right? So the people that paid the most were sitting in the front and all that. And when my parents saw how upset I was, they said, well, if you want to, we can go and we can stand in the back. There's always space. I said, that's not the issue. I had no idea that you had to pay in order to belong. And that led to, I mean, that was a sort of a moment, but that was preceded by some questioning before and after. But basically after that, I never went back to temple on my own accord, except for the question of wedding and bar mitzvah and all that. As soon as I started in college, the common sense in my college was a Marxist common sense. It was a public university in Argentina. And so there was already a question of religion and the role of religion in the world. I started reading more critical stuff. And I started meeting other people that offered alternative narratives, right? Alternative stories. And that said, like, so what do you think when the state of Israel was founded, like, was it an empty land? Like, it was just a land waiting for the Jews to come back. It was just like a sort of a sign that said, please don't stay here, someone is coming, right? Sort of like someone reserved the land. And I had never thought about that. And most of these things came from Jewish people, right? Sort of like Jewish critical people, because I think, or really, like, when you first start to hear that as a Jewish person coming from a non-Jew, you start to think, well, this is anti-Semitism. Even though I have to say, I very rarely experienced anti-Semitism growing up, or was I aware of it. That occasional fight in school, but it was sort of such a rare thing that led to fist fight and made us feel good about it in some way. That hearing that contested narrative in college was sort of a big shock. But I have to say, I seriously started traveling that when I moved to the US for grad school.
Interesting. Was there something that kind of provoked that?
I think it was reading more and more about the world. I was not reading much more about Palestine, but reading much more about what it means to be the empire, what it means to, like, once I moved to the US, I had to contend with the fact that I was coming from Argentina and I was moving to the US. And I was, what does it mean to be critical coming from the empire? What do you need to know about the role of the empire? What does it mean to be dominant in the world?
I'm wondering about your relationships in general. Have there been kind of new aspects that have been opened up through connecting with people? Have there been ways that you've kind of uncovered a new part of a relationship through yeah?
I think the first, I want to talk about this in two terms, right? One is the closest relationship I have, which is the one with mom. And then I want to talk about sort of broader issues of solidarity among other people, right? And my mom is, for me, a fascinating woman. She is extremely curious, and she's constantly learning and reading. And this is an issue, Zionism is an issue that I think and we talk about it, she never questioned this until what happened after the October terrorist attacks by Hamas. Like, she never questioned the idea of Israel's legitimacy as a country. She never questioned the idea of the others as barbarians. She never questioned this. It was, like you said, my mom was able to question a lot of things, but that was sort of the thing that was left there. In part because she's a child of Holocaust survivors, and because of all the history, of all the narrative that was received, and her own history. In part because she's surrounded by people that also never questioned this. But things have changed. I think that she, for the first time, saw two of the people that she respects the most, me and my youngest brother, really be critical of Israel in a way that, and Israel's actions and the whole project of Zionism, that instead of leading her to say, let's not talk about this, let's not fight, let her to read more, let her to listen to more podcasts, let her to have different kinds of questions. I'm not going to say she turned anti-Zionist. She did not. But she started doubting, which is super important. And it's maybe the most we can ask of people, right? To start being skeptical, to start asking questions, to start doubting. What comes out of that can be anything, but at least it's not a set thing. And it led to such interesting conversation with your mom, because it's interesting when you have something that you never questioned your whole life. And suddenly, the fact that sun rises every day is not obvious, right? So what happens when you question a foundational truth of yourself? You can shut yourself down, or when you're an extremely curious and intellectually open person like my mom is, you have conversations you never had before, you have connections you never had before, and you have fights you never had before, right?
It sounds like maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but part of that is having a foundation to rely on. So when your whole world shatters, you and one of your brothers is there to kind of walk with her, challenge, but also move with her along this process. Do you think part of what allowed that to happen?
Definitely, because I think if I had said, like many other people say, I don't talk to Zionists, I feel for me Zionists are the worst thing in the world. If I had said that, that would have meant I am shut down to the possibility of having the conversation, of her learning something new, and of me learning something new. I also learned something about my mom in that moment of her being open to that conversation. For me, I mean, I always deeply respect my mom, but this is different, right? Because it's, say, my mom went to college at the same time as I did. So she became a psychologist as an adult. And in the last decade, she specialized in treating families with trans kids and supporting them and supporting their kids, right? So that was amazing for me to think of, like, a 70-some-year-old woman getting into trans rights and trans psychology and all that. But in a way, that was not something that touched her personally, right? So it's a learning that for her was like a puzzle. It was something that she's committed to and all that. And I admire that. But I think it's different because there was no foundational truth that was questioned. It was just an expansion of her welcoming stance, of her inclusive stance. What's happening with Zionism is the breaking of foundational truth, and that is very different, right? And that is for me a different level of respect, if you want. I don't know what would happen to me when if I would question foundational truth.
Yeah. And what do you think was there a trigger to make this kind of educational shift possible? Is it just the horrors of the current genocide? Was it you and your brother pushing in a different way?
All of the above, right? Sort of, it was a combination of the fact that what started as a very strong argument in a WhatsApp group for the larger family, in which I was basically asked to not talk anymore. When I started questioning some of the things that were coming out of the extended family, that led to more intimate conversations that cannot be had on chat groups, right? That's one part. I think there's a general shift in the narrative in the media too, if you look where to look, if you know where to look, right? Critical media are much more present.
And I think, I remember you telling me about these WhatsApp chats, and I think it's, I don't want to go down the whole rabbit hole, but I think you can't divorce it from also national politics, right? I remember you sharing that there were also people who were pushed in one direction or another because the election was happening in Argentina.
Right. So briefly, there was a far-right candidate who won that election. And one of the things he did is, in the middle of the campaign, he started to convert to Judaism. And you can be cynical and say to court particular votes, or you can think about the turn of the far right in Israel and actually like an affiliation of politics, like a political affiliation with a way of thinking of a nationalism that is honest to who that person is, that candidate was. That was not cynical in that sense. It was equally dangerous or even more dangerous, but it was not. And then, so I don't know, I don't want to get into psychology, but that led to many people think, okay, if I stand with Israel, probably I have to vote with this guy, right? And so that combination was fascinating.
And I would imagine a few of the opposite of people who were repulsed and rejecting this far right alleged anarcho-capitalist who,
right?
Yeah.
And so the other part I want to talk about is, so besides my mom, you were talking about relationships. We can talk a little bit about what's going on at the university level, right? But I also started seeing where people fall, when things become dangerous, right? When real things are at stake, right? What happens with the discourse of social justice when it affects something that implicates you? And I think that built true bonds of solidarity and friendship, or strengthen them, and show me where people stand there. And I think that was really important in generating new relationships with colleagues and students and other people in this community.
Then maybe this is a good place to turn to. I don't want this to be to use the language of our discipline, like a move to innocence, but maybe talking a little bit about your own work and what you're comfortable with. I think to contextualize, it's difficult to explain the relationship between Teachers College and Columbia University, but it's part of Columbia, which is a center of a lot of what happened at the encampments last spring. So maybe if you could just talk a bit about kind of how you navigated the encampments and everything that happened after. And if you don't want to name names or anything like that, just your own experiences.
So the one thing I'm going to say about the relationship between Teachers College and Columbia is Teachers College is affiliated to Columbia University. What it means is we have our own president, our own board of trustees, right? But we have an affiliation. Our students can take courses there and are considered Columbia students, and vice versa. And so we can, there's a open flow of communication, but we have our own normatives and our own regulations. And this is very important for that conversation, right? Just to say that while Teachers College was not perfect, Teachers College never called the police on its own students. Teachers College did not discipline students after they participated in some of the activities. So there were a couple of things that are important to distinguish.
But I would argue that that maybe wasn't a natural thing, but was because there was pressure on TC to. Yeah.
True. But Barnard,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's pressures everywhere from multiple places. Like TC also had pressures to discipline. TC had also pressures to expel students. TC had also all those pressures, but for different conditions, for different regional forces, for different people, administrators, and all that, right? It was not the same. And so I think one thing I felt as soon as everything started happening, and as soon as people like Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, showed up to accuse the university of anti-Semitism, and as soon as all those things started spinning, I knew that as a self-identifying anti-Zionist Jew, I had a specific role to play there, which is I could say things and move in ways that other people could not. Because if one thing I could not be accused of, at least not easily, is anti-Semitism. And so that, I think, was really important for me. And it's not about me as a hero at all here, right? I could have done much more. But my own processing of what was going on is this is a moment in which my positionality opens up doors without the risk that it has for others, right? Sorry for the noise, it's the heater that...
We're giving folks the real New York experience.
Yeah. And so first, I would say things were agitated, but not out of the ordinary, until Minister Shafiq, the then president of Colombia, called the police the first time to clear the encampments at Columbia University. Right? Up to that point, there were the things that were sort of common of any large university, right? There were flyers, there were small marches, there were chants, but it didn't feel like out of the ordinary to me. I was have to say I was on sabbatical that term, which means I was not teaching, right? I was not receiving direct impact from students. I was in communication mode. But the first time that Shafiq called the police, that was a huge break. It was the first time since 1968 that the police were called on campus to address a non-criminal activity, right? Police had been called on campus before when there was a criminal investigation, right? But it was the first time that police was called to discipline students, to clear out campus. They were invited in. And that was a rupture, right? So for many faculty, for many students, that was a moment that changed everything. And it was a moment that also signaled harsh disciplinary measures towards students and faculty that were speaking against the genocide that Israel was committing. And I started seeing our Teachers College students' expectations for a response, for a stance, for saying something out loud, right? While I would say administration was pretty quiet. They were not denouncing the encampment. They were not denouncing the police presence. They were just quiet. And that was not the case for all affiliate institutions. Union Theological Seminary immediately sent an email saying, we're never going to call the police on our students. We support your right to protest. While Barnard sent the opposite message to their students. So Columbia was pretty much brewing with struggle, but what different affiliate institutions did was different, and TC was quiet. And so I sent a message I directed the doctoral program, and I sent a message to our students supporting the right to protest. And also, with other colleagues, we started organizing to demand of our administration that none of our students be charged. And the argument, we sent a letter that sort of came out of my email, but it was a collective letter from, I would say, a significant portion of the faculty. I'm not going to say it was half. I don't know how many, right? Because they're not widely circulated, but it was for signing signatures, but it was circulated widely when it was created. Our argument was that anything that happens in a university is a pedagogical situation. It's not a criminal situation. So you don't call the police on your students. It should be a principle that unless someone commits a crime, you address it as a pedagogical issue. And the university has a million resources to address it as a pedagogical issue. And so we sent a letter, and that created a lot of blowback from other faculty who thought the opposite, that thought that anything that was disruptive should be cleared away, that this was clearly an anti-Semitic encampment and that it needed to be addressed, that was not covered by any First Amendment rights or by any university regulations, and that the police presence was required to feel safe. This led to a lot of back and forth and very ugly name calling. And I think while this happened behind the scenes, so students didn't see much of this, students did start talking, and especially as students were arrested. And this was much heightened the second time the police came, which I live on campus, and I had never seen like that. Like basically the police coming with military equipment, with dozens of trucks and weapons and a way of occupying the university that I had never seen, and that was invited by Misha Peak for a second time. So that was deeply traumatic for students here, for faculty. I think that faculty activism at Teachers College is one of the factors that led to Teachers College demanding that all disciplinary action at Columbia for the TC students move to TC instead of staying at Columbia, and then TC dropping all those charges. While also coming up in the new academic year with new regulations that preemptively disciplined adult behavior. So I don't want to say that the whole administration was positive on this, right?
I guess, the last thing I'm wondering is, what does it look like now? Especially you were on a wonderful sabbatical that allowed you to, in a way, step outside the classroom for a little bit. And then you come back to these new, very repressive regulations, and come to an environment where students have been attacked, and the genocide is ongoing, and then you're expected to just start a new semester, welcome a new doctoral cohort. How do you approach that?
I think in many ways, the Columbia administration's approach won, right? So students are scared, faculty are scared. There are a lot of things that are not talked about. You see a lot less activism visibly. The Columbia gates are locked and continue to be locked. Community members cannot walk through campus with an ID, which was not the case, and now it's been litigated because that campus is blocking public streets and should be open. So in that sense, it's depressing to think of fear tactics and the ways in which intimidation works, and the curtailing of inquiry, criticism, of discussion. There's a lot of things we should be arguing, we should be discussing, we should be encountering different perspectives on, but people feel scared. And universities in general, with differences, but at least Teachers College, has shown that it's much more afraid of public scrutiny and of political scrutiny than it is willing to defend its own mission in many ways. But also, things happened, right? Sort of people were out there and people did have those arguments, and that leaves a mark. And things do not go back, right? And so I think that while institutionally there's a sense of fear and intimidation, within each classroom things have changed. And I see in my classroom, like, the situation in Gaza has come up several times since, and we discuss it, and we acknowledge different perspectives on this, because it's on people's minds, right? Even if they would not say this publicly, even they would not demonstrate publicly. So you win some, you lose some. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I thought of so much of the conversations we've had over the years in relation to these things, right? That last you kind of covered in that last statement, just the idea of, like, curriculum as this constant negotiation of who won, who lost, but also talking about classrooms and public life as kind of educational experiments that make new ways of thinking and being possible. I don't know what we do with that, right? I don't know how much materially changes. Columbia is still heavily invested in Israel, and I'm excited when I see somebody wearing a keffiyeh on campus, but I don't know that changes the kind of the educational terrain.
No, but for example, I don't know that students were paying that much attention to where the endowments are, like, so to where the investments of the university are. And so even if they did not get a commitment to divest, they did not get a commitment to certain things, I don't know that the university right now could easily just invest in, say, a weapons manufacturer without being deeply questioned, right? And so people are paying attention to other things, and that's really important.
And I think there's something about, another theme that we've talked about many times, that we don't know. There's something emergent and unpredictable, and there's an entire generation who have been awoken by the last 15 months. And just because the university is securitized and repressive in a new way doesn't mean that that's the end of the conversation.
Saying that without ignoring the fact that students were expelled. That at Columbia did lose the right to an education, that there were real consequences for people here, and much more severe consequences, of course, in Gaza itself.
Right, of course. Yeah. I think, I wanted this to be an educator friends episode, but that does raise, we have two entire episodes about, do we even bother with the university anymore? Is there any hope for university life? But maybe we could leave that for a lunch sometime.
Today's episode was produced by Jordan Amran and Samantha Haley. As always, we'd love if people would rate us wherever they listen to podcasts and follow us on Instagram. We're there at Another Ed is Possible. We continue to promote Gaza mutual aid campaigns on Instagram. We'll be sharing more soon. Thank you as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.